Hello, and welcome to the Ancient Art of Fishing channel. Now, I spend most of my year in Wisconsin, but there is a month or two scattered out through the year where I'll visit my parents in St. Louis, and I will fish the areas around St. Louis. Now, I don't know St. Louis area as well as I do know southwestern Wisconsin, southeastern Wisconsin, or south central Wisconsin because I spend like 11 months out of the year at south central Wisconsin. But I have fished the St. Louis area decently extensively and fished all the rivers, the Merrimack, the Mississippi, and the Missouri. And I'm going to tell you my favorite spots to fish these creeks, lakes, or rivers. Now, I haven't really made too many videos. I only started making videos like last year, but I'll get to that later this year. I like coming to St. Louis because St. Louis does have two species of fish that Wisconsin doesn't have, the wipers and the blue gato fish, or catfish. I'd call catfish gato fish, so just bear with me on that. So let's actually start off with some of the smaller creeks. And by smaller creeks, I mean Bonham Creek. Bonham Creek is actually a really good fishery. It's a small fishery, but it's a very good fishery. The first place I'm going to start off is in the Wild Horse Creek neighborhood. And there is actually a path in the neighborhood. You can park near the park. It's for residents only, but you can park near the park. And there's a trail that goes back here. Now, there's two places, if you go backwards on the trail, where the creek pools into two deep pools. And in the warmer months, there are gato fish in there as well as other fish. Even in the freezing winter months, there are pretty big creek chubs in there, so you can always go there to get some bait. Unlike Wisconsin, Missouri does allow you to take bait fish or bait, cut bait or live bait across waters as long as it's not an invasive species, and B, you don't cross state lines with it. So the little pond itself here has plenty of bass as well. But Bonham Creek behind Wild Horse Creek, behind this park at Wild Horse Creek, just follow the path. The path is about a mile, and there are plenty of fish concentrated in those two pools. If you go downstream, there is like another place where there's a lot of fallen trees and stuff, and there are catfish there, but you can easily get snagged there, especially if you hook a big fish and it pulls you beneath the tree, you're kind of screwed. But there are some pretty big fish there. And there's also kind of like a little waterfall. It's not a dam, but it's like a waterfall falling into a deep pool. In the summer, I wouldn't recommend fishing there because the place you have to stand is kind of grassy and with a lot of like some fallen wood. There might be like a copperhead or a cottonmouth there. And if you stand there, you might get bit and die. But if you're willing to take the risk, that is actually a pretty good place to fish as well. Now, going down Bonham Creek, you get to like this area behind Walmart essentially, and it's on the Missouri Greenway trailhead for Monarch on the Monarch Chesterfield Levee Trail, and essentially Bonham Creek eventually crosses Highway 64, and right below Highway 64 there is a very, very deep pool for the creek. And in that deep pool, in the summer months, there are hordes of carp. So if you like bow fishing, that is a place to be. There's also wipers there, white bass, catfish, and suckers, and an assortment of other fish there as well. You can also fish basically like this entire area behind Walmart. And there are like catfish, suckers, and like bass in that creek, as well as creek chubs, of course. So that is Bonham Creek. Let's actually move on to Dardine Creek, which is, I think, a little bit more of a well-known creek around the Chesterfield area, Chesterfield, St. Louis area, especially if you are in the St. Charles area. Now, the place I want to mention on Dardine Creek is this 370 Lakeside Park. The lake itself actually has plenty of fish, but there is an actual spillway coming into the lake from the creek, and that spillway is a good place to get some catfish, as well as some bass, carp, and other fish. Dardine Creek behind here also has plenty of fish, especially in the warmer months. But part of it is a reserve, and you can't fish there. I'm not exactly sure which part's which, but the spillway area you can actually fish in. This entire area you can't fish December through February, but that's okay because there's no fish in there December through February anyways, when it's not frozen, which it isn't most of the time because Missouri doesn't really get that cold. But the spillway is actually pretty good for fishing. I'm not really sure if 618 Fishing has ever fished here, but if he hasn't, he should, because that is a pretty productive spillway in the summer, and I would fish there if I wasn't here in Wisconsin all the time. So that is Dardine Creek. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and mention this as part of Dardine Creek instead of making it part of my Mississippi River thing. Where Dardine Creek confluences with the Mississippi, there's a park there. It's called Riverside Landings, Charles County Park, St. Charles County Park. And that place has plenty of drum, carp, catfish, and others. I haven't really caught any big catfish there, but there are plenty of good eater-sized catfish, both blues and channels. around that area. And also a lot of drum and white bass if you're interested in that. So that is Dardine Creek. The third place is going to be Creve Lake. Creve Lake is fairly well known. Some people say it's overfished. I don't really think it is. Creve Lake, the entire lake's pretty good for fishing. And there's also kind of like the spillway-ish creek thing that comes out of the lake. There's like a little bit of a waterfall area coming out from Creve Creek. And that place also has pretty good catfishing as well on Creve Coeur. So Creve Coeur Lake, the entire area around the lake, there's a walkway around the lake. You can easily fish the lake. And also Creve Coeur Creek coming out of the lake, especially in kind of like the waterfall area. That is definitely a great place to fish. So that is Creve Coeur Lake, Creve Coeur Creek. The other thing I want to mention, not on this map, is there's a park called Chesterfield Town Center Park. It is actually quite good for the kids. There's a lot of big bass in there. There's about like 10-pound catfish in there. There's a lot of big bluegills in there. It is only catch and release, so you will not be able to eat anything from it. So there are a lot of really big fish in there. And that is called like Chesterfield Town Center Park. It's only a couple miles from where my parents live, so I fished there once. Even it was during more of the colder months, but there are a lot of catfish, bass, and big bluegills. Like I'm talking 7-8 inch plus bluegills, but it is catch and release only, so please remember that. Other place I want to mention is Bush Lakes, and especially Bush Lake 33. It's also called Crat Run Lake. I think it is the biggest out of the Bush Lakes. And basically on this side with a little the white path here, there are crappie beds. And in the spring, there's a lot of crappie there. So if you want to eat crappie, go here. There's really good crappie here. Dardine Creek does actually run behind here. But if you're at Cratlown Lake, you're probably here for crappie in the spring. And crappie are here throughout the year, but they're definitely most numerous in the spring when they're spawning. And they actually ask you to remove any crappie that you catch because there's so many of them here, up to your daily limit, I think, of 25. Crat Run Lake also has channel catfish and flathead catfish. There are beginning to be some blues in there, but blue catfish are best in big rivers. So Crat Run Lake, channel catfish and flatheads, and crappie over here on this side. There's obviously also bass and bluegill in the lake as well. So that is Crat Run Lake. Lake 35 also, just as we mentioned, that is one of the few lakes in the area that actually has muskie. I think the biggest ones are around 40 inches or so. Muskie aren't native to Missouri, but they do stock them in Lake 35. Lake 35, you might need a boat because it is actually a lot deeper than Lake 33. So that is Bush Lakes. The other lake I want to mention is the area around Forest Park. Now, it's Post-Dispatch Lake has plenty of channels and some flatheads, and they also stock it with trout, and there's obviously bass in the lake. And obviously there's a walkway around the lake, so you can basically fish anywhere on the lake. It's very, very well kept in Forest Park. So that is a very good place to fish in the warmer months, and actually throughout the year. So Post-Dispatch Lake at Forest Park. Very, very nice to fish. So let's actually move on to the rivers now. Let's go to the big river because that's actually the smallest river in the area. And we're going to mention two places. One is Rockport Beach Park. Now, there is a big waterfall here. It's actually quite scenic. If you're a photographer, you've probably taken a photo of this place. But upstream from the waterfall, there's catfish and smallies. Downstream, like in May, there's a lot of smallies. There's also white bass that gather here in May. And there's suckers and walleye here as well. Now, in the hottest summer months, this water is boiling. You're not going to get too much action. And also, I think between Memorial and Labor Day, they do charge a $5 parking fee. And one thing about this place is you can't actually keep, well, I think it's a Missouri regulation, you can't really keep bass from February, I think, until Memorial Day weekend here. So, but there are a lot of smallies in here during the late spring, early summer phase, and probably in the autumn as well, although I've never actually fished it in the autumn. But you can also fish here where there's like a decent amount of catfish and carp. And, around the waterfall, below the waterfall, there's all sorts of fish, including bass, catfish, suckers, and even walleyes on the big river. Now, moving down the big river, you will get to another kind of like spillway mill place, and it's actually called Barnes Mill City Park. And this place, there's a little bit of like a spillway here. You can actually fish around this area. And like there's actually a decent amount of panfish, probably some bass and other fish around there too. The water condenses into a pool here, so there are obviously going to be some catfish and other fish as well on the big river. This is a little bit further downstream than the Rockport Beach Park. Now moving on to the mighty Mississippi. The first one I have to mention is Alton Dam. Now Alton Dam is actually the last dam on the Mississippi. Now I fished on the Missouri side. If you go to the National Great Rivers Museum, that's on the Illinois side. I think if you have a Missouri license, you can fish on either side, but I'm not really sure. There is a parking lot on the Missouri side, and you can actually fish like right here below the dam. Right here on this chunk below the dam is the only calm water spot. It's still very turbulent, but like your bait won't just flow completely downstream. You will need a very heavy bank sinker to actually anchor your weight, and you'll probably get snagged fairly often. But there are huge blue catfish here, and there's also flatheads, but I think the huge blues are what most people are after. You can also fish at a boat ramp or even downstream. There is like a little creek that actually empties out here. You can also fish there, or you can jump over to the Illinois side and fish there. There's like big fish on both sides. Also, here with the West Alton Shelter, Alton Slough, there are like channel catfish there, bullheads, bass and everything else. You can fish in these little ponds too, and that's not bad. There's also the Lincoln Shield Recreation Area, and that is kind of like a slower part of the river here because it's blocked by essentially this part of land, and you can also get some fishing in right there. So that's very nice, and that is basically on the Mississippi, Alton Dam, all the area around Alton Dam. Very, very nice. It's about 40 minutes from where I live, or where my parents live rather, on the Mississippi River, Alton Dam. And a little bit further downstream, you get to the Missouri-Mississippi confluence, and you can actually go to the very confluence point. It's called literally the mouth of the Missouri River, and there's a path that leads precisely to the mouth of the Missouri River. Now, the Missouri-Mississippi confluence is very interesting because both rivers have about the same flow rate, so you can't actually tell which one's the main channel. It's actually very hard to tell which one's the main channel. I actually think the Missouri is the main channel, but they just continue to call it the Mississippi because the Mississippi kind of just like goes straight downward, and that's its path. But I actually think the Missouri is the main channel into the Mississippi. But whatever, that's another debate for another time. But the Missouri-Mississippi confluence has a lot of catfish, and a lot of other good river fish. So you'll want to check that out. I will have to say though, the park, the drive into the park is only open at certain times of the year, and I'm not really sure when it's actually open. And if you want to go to the mouth of the Mississippi River area, you have to basically, it's from the Alton Dam thing. There's like essentially a mile to drive here. And like I said, I don't really know what time of the year this is actually open, but a very, very nice place to fish on the Mississippi. You can call it on the Missouri too. It's the confluence point. Further downstream, you get to Cave County Park. Now, I've fished here before. I don't really like this place, mainly because Cave County Park, it's just too snaggy, and the current's very, very strong. So I've gotten more snags here than I've actually caught fish. But there are a couple of slow water moving areas, especially near the docks, where you can actually catch some fish. So that is Cave County Park. And last of all, but not least of all, I want to mention the downtown places, especially under the bridge, like E.A.'s Bridge and stuff. And there are huge, huge catfish around the Gateway Arch area under like Eads Bridge. So that is another area you'll definitely want to look at, as well as, like I would actually fish this like little channel thing, but I think it's actually private property. I'm not really sure if you can fish it or not, but under the bridges downtown, really good catfishing. That is the Mississippi River. Of a note, I don't fish the Mississippi quite as much as the other rivers because it's a little farther from me, but those places I have fished, and they're quite good. The Missouri River is one of my favorite rivers to fish, and there is a place that's actually quite near where my parents live. It's called Daniel Boone Bridge. Now, Daniel Boone Bridge, people do know about it, but the nearest parking lot's this outlet mall. My favorite place to fish here is actually on this side of the bridge, where like the actual bridge creates an eddy. You can also fish on the nearer side, and it's much closer to the parking lot. And people have caught really big fish on either side because there's like wing dikes here on this side. So people have caught really big fish here on either side. But my favorite place to fish is actually here on the other side of the bridge. Now, I will warn you, it is off the Katy Trail, but if you actually go from the parking lot, it is like a 1.5 mile walk across the interstate bridge. And this area is very muddy. And I think it's really only good when the water is between maybe like 10 and 15 feet on the Missouri River at St. Charles reading. Otherwise, if it's too high, the place is just kind of messy and not that great. The flow is too strong. If it's too low, there's just not as much water there. But it's actually extremely muddy. And yeah, it's kind of a long walk to get to. So there's not as many people that fish there. I don't mind making the walk, but if you have like young kids, you obviously aren't going to fish there because they don't want to walk 2 miles to fish in a really muddy spot where your legs can literally sink into the mud if the water's recently retreated. I think it's best in the fall or spring actually, and probably the fall because the water is generally pretty high in the spring. If the water's above 20 feet, it's basically like no go. So that is Boone's Bridge. The other place is the going upstream for the next one. It's the Klondike Park boat ramp. Now the boat ramp has a couple of places where there's like fairly strong eddies. There's a lot of snags here, but a couple of places here where there's like fairly strong, like not strong, where the current kind of like mellows down and there's like eddies here where there's like more still water. And there's catfish and other fish in those eddies in the warmer months. In the colder months, there's basically nothing here. But in the warmer months, there are like little eddies that like the boat ramp actually forms. And because of that, there's actually fish there. Now, at the actual Klondike Park, there is a lake there. And I'm not really going to talk about a lake. The lake has plenty of bass. But what I actually want to talk about is if you take the hiking path from Park Beach on the opposite side of the lake, and you actually get to the Bigelow Creek outlet into the Missouri River. Now, this is actually a pretty good place to fish. A lot of people don't know about it because it's quite a walk away from the actual park, but there is a bit of shoreline you can actually stand on, and there are fish in that confluence, the Bigelow Creek confluence on the Missouri River, catfish, drum, the usual stuff, the usual river fish. And I think that's actually a pretty good fishing spot. Moving downstream from here, and just upstream from Boone's Bridge, you get to Centaur Shoot, or Howell's Island on the Missouri. Now, a lot of people know about this, and people don't really like fishing here all that much, but I actually really like fishing here. The conservation area, there's a parking lot, and essentially, like, you have this little road that goes in here. Now, some people will actually fish on this side, and there's blue catfish here when the water is high and when it's not too cold. And some people actually like fishing right off the dam dock thing, and there's actually gar and bass there. However, when the water is below 14, 15 feet, you can actually walk clear across, and I like to walk about 100, 200 yards this way and fish the actual chute. The chutes, if you look at it on Fishbrain, it says it's like 1 foot deep. It's much deeper than 1 feet. And I've caught buffalo, I've caught catfish, drum, and other fish there as well. I'm pretty sure there's gars hanging in there as well. And during snagging season, it's probably not bad. Also, I know there's paddlefish in this stretch of the river as well. Don't try to catch them. It's illegal, except in March, I believe. So that's the regulations there. Centaur Shoot, I think it's like a very nice place for me to fish at least. And of course, there's the Lewis and Clark Boathouse downstream. Some people refer to it as Frontier Park, but it's actually not Frontier Park. It's the area right in front of the boathouse and museum. And it is very, very much full of fish because there is this like artificial island thingy out here with a spillway here. I haven't really ever tried the spillway, but right in front of here, like there's a bunch of brush piles. And when it gets darker during the hotter months, warmer months, there are definitely blue catfish and flathead catfish around this area. And some channels as well, obviously, and other rough fish and river fish. So essentially, like all these jutting outs into the river actually make a bunch of eddies and reverse flows, and there's a lot of big fish in those flows. In the winter months, there's not all that much. There's probably a couple of gars, and I've caught a carp or two in the winter months, but in the summer months, it is very, very fishy. So that is the Missouri River. Now we'll move on to the Merrimack River. So the Merrimack River, the The first one is going to be Keifer Creek at Castlewood, and that is the mouth of Keifer Creek. I think a lot of people don't actually like this place all that much, but I have fished here, and I actually like it best when it's flooded, when the Merrimack is actually flooded. Because when the Merrimack's actually flooded, yes, it's harder to access, but the actual place is actually better when the Merrimack is actually flooded. The water is higher, more fish actually come into this specific area. And because of that, I've caught catfish, drum, and a bunch of other fish. When it's not flooded, there's some white bass, and there's also like some gar in that area. So the Keifer Creek confluence on the Merrimack River, and I believe it's like right there. It looks very, very different when the Merrimack's actually flooded. So next we actually have Fishpot Creek coming into the Merrimack. Now to get here, this is Merrimack Trailhead, Greenway Trailhead, and it is Arnold's Grove. And there's a little path that leads here, and you have to cut through some trees, and there's like a little bit, like when the Merrimack's not flooded. If the Merrimack's flooded, you can't really fish the spot. When the Merrimack's not flooded, there's like this little sand spot that you can actually stand on and throw in here. Now in the warmer months, there's definitely catfish, there's definitely drum, and there's definitely bass and even walleye in Fishpot Creek. Between December and February, there's basically nothing. But in the other months, there is fish activity in this creek on the Merrimack River. The next one down is actually going to be Grand Glaze Creek, and that's actually Simpson Park on Merrimack, or Merrimack Landing Park is where you really want to go. You can park at Simpson's Park, and there's like a trail down here. There's also like this little dam here on Grand Glaze Creek, and little dams below the spillway. There's some like smaller fish below the spillway. But here you have like large grass carp and other river fish on the Grand Glaze Creek confluence with the Merrimack River. And then the next one would actually be Hamilton Creek confluence, and that's at another park. But realistically, like this confluence is only really available. Hamilton confluence is only really available when the water is actually quite low. So we're going to kind of skip that one. The next one down is actually George Winter Park. And this one's actually really good. This is where the Merrimack like expands out into this like lake-like thing. Now in George Winter Park, just a little bit upstream, Fenton Creek empties it out into the Merrimack. And in the warmer months, Fenton Creek, where it nears the Merrimack, is fairly deep in some spots, and there are good fish there. Depending on like how high the river is and how overgrown it is at this time, you might actually be able to reach the confluence. In the winter months, you can reach the confluence, but realistically, in the winter months, there's nothing there. There's also, if you follow this thing back a couple hundred yards, somewhere around here, there's also like a spillway, and there's some fish in the spillway, although it's kind of hard to stand in the spillway, so not really sure if I would fish it, but there is there's like a pipe spillway here somewhere on the back here, and I heard that's pretty good for fish. I've tried it once in the winter, didn't catch anything, but in the summer, there's fish there, and definitely there's fish in the creek as well. And moving on from George Winter Park, by the way, there's also like really big gar and paddlefish here for snagging during those respective seasons. Moving down from George Winter Park, you will actually get to Lower Merrimack Park. Now, this is actually one of my favorite fishing spots because this is a natural widening of the Merrimack River. It's also the deepest part on the lower Merrimack. I believe it's like in the center, in some spots, it's almost 40 feet deep. Now, you just follow the trail, and like around here, this is like where you're going to end up fishing. This spot is not available when the Merrimack's very high in terms of water. The Merrimack needs to be low in terms of water for you to actually fish the spot, and the spot is extremely muddy, but it's worth it, especially in snagging season from September until January, because there are state record-sized long-nosed gar here. If you want to catch a 40-pound long-nosed gar, this is the place to go. Most people snag them, but you can catch them the regular way as well. Like literally state record-sized long-nosed gar. There's huge gar down here. A lot of Asian carp if you want to snag those. Take as many as you want. The DNR won't care if you snag Asian carp. But you got to be careful because there are paddlefish here too, and those can only be snagged during their specific seasons. But I've also caught bass, and I've caught white bass and spotted bass here, and plenty of gato fish and drum. So there's a huge mix of fish down here. It's very rich in terms of fish life. Lower Merrimack Park, and it's pretty good year round, except when the water's like super freezing. I've actually fished this in January, and I've caught fish even in January. It's not, as the activity is not as high in January unless you're snagging, but generally, like the activity is very, very high here. Very good place to fish year round. Suzanne Pond's right up the road as well. So if you're into like stock trout, that's a nice place to get stock trout. And the last place in the Merrimack I'm gonna mention is very close to the confluence of the Mississippi, and it is Flam City Boat Ramp. It's essentially like a mile or two up from the Mississippi confluence. I think it's the last place you can fish on the Merrimack, and there is like a slow, like slightly downstream from the boat ramp itself. I can't find it on the map, but there's a very area of slow water straight downstream from the boat ramp that you can actually sit kind of like on the side of the shore and fish there. And there's some good like smallies and other fish there, as well as catfish and other fish. The closer you get to the Merrimack Mississippi confluence, the better the catfishing is. So that area is going to be pretty good during the warmer months. In the colder months, probably not too much there, but in the warmer months, pretty good fishing. So Flam City Boat Launch. Pretty easy to find on the map. Can't really find it just scrolling around right now, but if you just like type it in straight, it's not that hard to find. So that is my conclusion of all the areas that I personally like to fish in around St. Louis. That includes some parks, and I've divided up into the four or five major rivers that are there and some of the creeks. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you got a couple of fishing spots. And remember, all these fishing spots take patience. You can't just go there, throw a lure in the water, and expect to get a fish in 5 minutes. That's generally not how fishing works, unless you're fishing for corn for carp on that Bonham Creek area. Then you can just take as many of them as you want. But if you're fishing for like non-carp fish, you generally have to wait for quite a while before you catch one, but they can be very, very big. So hope you enjoyed this bit. And if you're visiting St. Louis or live there, hope you learned something. Like and subscribe, hit that bell notifications button. Thank you and have a nice day, everyone.